Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for stopping by. A couple of videos ago, I shared how to create these cards here that kind of have a collage image with a seahorse and text behind it. But I wanted to share how to create this look with a variety of other stamps. Now you could use, say, this stamp here and get almost an identical look, but I'm going to use the butterfly from this one, and I'm going to use this script stamp here to go behind it. So the very first step here is we are going to take our butterfly stamp, we're going to put it in our stamp positioner and position the stamp the way we're going to want it on the card. Any way is going to work. It doesn't matter how you position this stamp on the card for this technique. I'm going to use Versamark ink, which is a watermark ink, but it's a perfect sticky ink for embossing, and we're going to emboss this butterfly. I'm actually going to create two cards at the same time, just because, like the last card I couldn't decide whether I wanted black or white embossing. This time I couldn't decide whether I wanted silver or gold, so I'm going to do both. I'm going to do a little bit of variation between the two, just so you can see a few differences. So I stamped the image twice. I'm using watercolor paper here because I am going to be using some color sprays on the background to get a really, really quick background coloring. And by using watercolor paper, it's going to help take that moisture from the sprays as well. You could also use mixed media paper, that would work. Now I accidentally forgot to use my embossing powder tool on my paper first. So I have some areas where the embossing powder is sticking that's not on the image. It's really easy to get rid of this. You just want to use a brush to brush it off really quickly before we go emboss it. Now it's much easier to use the embossing powder tool ahead of time and remove any static or any fingerprints or whatever, so that powder doesn't stick to it in the first place. But if it does, you definitely want to get rid of it before you start heating the embossing powder. So now I'm using my embossing tool to heat that powder and melt it. It's very easy to see when it's melted. It goes from like a dull granular look to glossy and shiny and smooth. So for this second one, I'm definitely going to be using my embossing powder tool. I just brushed it on there, and you'll see that by doing that, I don't have the powder sticking all over the place where I don't want it to go. I'm going to do the same thing as the first card. I'm going to stamp it twice with the Versamark because of the texture with the watercolor paper. I want to make sure that I get a nice clear image. So by stamping it twice, I can ensure that I've got a nice clean, crisp image and I've got that ink on there perfectly. Then I'm going to use my silver powder, and you can see right away, because I use that embossing powder tool, I don't have the embossing powder sticking all over the place where it shouldn't be. I always do the embossing powder over a scrap piece of paper so that any of the excess gets caught by that scrap piece of paper and gets put right back into the container. So you can be quite liberal with your embossing powder. You don't need to be stingy with it. I've taught classes where people are just putting tiny little bits on. Put lots on to make sure that you've got some good coverage, because all the excess goes right back into the container, so there's no mess and there's no waste. So now I'm taking a baby wipe. You could use just a wet cloth. You could use stamp cleaner, whatever you like to clean your stamps. I'm just doing something quick here. And I'm going to stamp the same butterfly on some Masking Magic. Now, Masking Magic is a product that's meant to create masks for your projects. You could also just stamp this onto some plain printer paper and then use a temporary adhesive to get a very similar product or similar look, or to create this very same technique. But I do really like the Masking Magic. It can be used in so many different ways, and it's really, really easy to use, and it saves some steps of adding temporary adhesive to paper. So I just used some StazOn ink to stamp that image on there. You want to use a permanent ink, something that's not going to smudge or anything while we're cutting this image out. I'm using my favorite detail cutting scissors. These are Cutter Bee scissors, and I've used them for years. I've probably had them for, I want to say 15 years, maybe not that much, but I've had them for years, and they cut just as well as the first day I got them. So I definitely recommend investing in a really good pair of detail cutting scissors. So when you do things like this, you get a nice clean, crisp image, and you're not fighting with your scissors. I've got my image all cut out here. The part that was cut off, you can keep it if you want to possibly use to mask around the butterfly for other projects. I won't be using it for this one. I will only be using the butterfly image. So I'm placing that butterfly image right over my embossing on this card here. You want to make sure that all the lines match up. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our background stamp and we're going to stamp it right over the image with the mask on top of it. And what that's going to do is going to protect that image so we don't have any of the embossing ink on top of it while we go to do our stamping and embossing. And by doing this, it's going to appear that this script stamp is behind the butterfly. We're not going to have any script right over the butterfly image, and it's going to look like the script is going behind the butterfly. So it's going to mimic the look of the seahorse image with the script behind it. There's a lot of different stamps on the market now, and even there's a couple of Stampers Anonymous Tim Holtz ones that have a similar look to it like this, that have a script or a postcard or something behind an image. And they're really fun to work with and play with, but it's a great way to, or it's great to know different ways to get that same look with different techniques so that you can use your creativity and just really come up with all sorts of different fun collages or whatnot, if you will, for your cards. So now that we've got that stamped, I'm putting my embossing powder on it, and I was actually quite surprised that none of the embossing powder stuck to the mask on top of the butterfly. I suspected, because I was stamping on top, that I would have the embossing powder would stick to the Versamark ink on top of that mask, but none of it did. Some of it did stick around the outside edges of that mask, so it did get embossed a little bit when I embossed the text, but I was surprised that none went to the front of it. And that mask is still usable. I'm going to use it for my second card here. So I'm repeating the exact same process as the first. The only difference is I'm going to be using gold embossing powder on this one because this is the gold one. So once again, I'm putting that mask down, and I do notice that it's not quite as sticky as it was the first time because I have a little bit of that embossing on the outside edges, but it worked perfectly fine. There was no embossing powder that snuck underneath that, so it worked perfectly for what it needed to do. So once again, I'm using that Versamark ink and I'm stamping the background. For the background stamp, I only actually stamped it once because if there were some spots that were missed, I didn't mind getting that look. It was going to be totally fine, and it was just, in my opinion, going to add to the look of the technique. So I took the mask off for this one while I was embossing it, just because it started lifting up a little bit again anyways, so I figured I might as well take it off. And I'm just going to tap off the excess of the embossing powder, and then we are going to heat it once again with our heat tool. Now, when it comes to heat tool, you definitely need a tool that's made for embossing powder. I used to work at a scrapbook store for many, many years, and I've had many people giving me suggestions on other alternatives that they think they could be used. You need an embossing tool. A blow dryer will not work because it will just dry the ink and blow the powder off. I've had other people that have put it on like hot plates and whatever to melt it, and while that does work, there's a lot more dangers to it than having an embossing gun and using that. Now, my embossing tool I've had for probably about 30 years now, so they last a long time. It's really worth it getting a nice embossing tool and having a tool that's going to last a long, long time. So when I like to use sprays, I like to spray the back of my paper as well as my surface to kind of suction that paper down. Now on this particular project, this is the first time it's kind of backfired me, and it started to curl up because of the water on the back of it. But you'll see by the finished product, it works totally fine. It doesn't ruin anything. I'm not looking for certain sprays in certain areas here for this particular project. I'm just trying to get kind of a sky look. So I'm using my light blue color, which is Tumbled Glass, and then the second color that I'm using, which is a little bit dark blue, is Mermaid Lagoon. And I'm spraying those, I'm trying to push the corners down just to kind of get them stuck on my desk, but it didn't work. My paper is now almost dry. There's still some areas that are a little bit wet, but what I want to do for the background is I'm using a pink here as well as a purple. So the purple is Wilted Violet, I think. Now I'm second guessing myself. It'll be in the description. All the supplies that I've used will be listed on there. So I'm just creating some splatters in the background. I want to paint this butterfly with these colors, and I want to just kind of have them coordinate with the back and just kind of have it tie in together. So I'm using some Oxide spray as well as some regular Distress spray because I like the different looks that the two give. Oxide has more of an oxidized frosted look, whereas the Distress spray has more of a transparent look. The colors are a little bit brighter. So I'm just flicking those on the back, just creating some splotches, some dots. It's going to be fairly random. I'm going to be okay with wherever they go. You'll notice on the one on the right, I put the mask back on there when I did my spray, as well as for the speckles. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep my butterfly the same color as the watercolor paper. You see the difference right there. But I want you to see the different way that the colors look when I go to watercolor. I'm using watercolor pencils to watercolor. These are brand new. They're Distress watercolor pencils. And I've taken my 3 sets and I've put them in color order. So I will put down in the description what sets the colors that I'm using are from. I'm using walnut stain, picked raspberry, seedless preserves, and shaded lilac. So I'm starting out with the walnut stain in the center for the butterfly body. And for the playing that I've done with the watercolor pencils, for me, I have found that I have the best results if I use my water brush and just pick up the color right from the crayon and then color from there. I have tried it in the past where I scribbled on the paper and then watercolored, which I have had success with other crayons, but I found that I didn't like the result with the Distress watercolor crayons. I got a little bit of scratching on the paper from doing it that way, and I prefer not to have that. So that's why I'm using the method that I am using. I'll link at the end of the video to the first video I did with the watercolor pencils and just playing around with them and experimenting with them. If you're interested in seeing a little bit more how they work, that'll satisfy some of your curiosity there. So for the butterfly wings, I'm going from the pink to the lilac. So I'm starting with the picked raspberry. Then I will be doing the seedless preserves, which is a purple, but it's got a pink tone to it. And then finally, I'll be doing the shaded lilac as the last color. And while I am painting them, I am kind of trying to blend between the two colors as I'm going. I want there to be a nice blend between the colors, but I do want to have a distinct amount of each one of the colors to be able to see it. And as you can see, I'm painting each or both of the 2 different backgrounds at exactly the same time. So you don't have to really worry too much about the paint drying and getting watermarks or whatever. I didn't find that I had that. I chose to use the watercolor pencils with this because they end up being a little bit more opaque, a little bit creamier than using Distress refills for watercolor painting. For years, I've used the Distress refills, which are the refills for the ink pads, and I really enjoy using that for watercoloring. I like the fact that it gives the one product, which is a refill for ink pads, a second job, if you will. I like having the same colors in the watercolors that I do in my stamp pads. And I like the fact that they're nice and transparent. I find the watercolor pencils to be a little bit more opaque. They're not as opaque as, say, Oxide inks or pigment inks or whatever, but they do have a little bit more opacity to them. And because the one on with the silver embossing, I already have some of the Distress sprays on the background, I wanted to make sure that the paint that I was going to use was going to be able to show up through over top of that Distress spray. And you can see how the 2 different butterflies are looking. The one with the gold embossing is the one that I masked the butterfly off, and the colors are a little bit brighter. The one with the silver embossing, they're not quite as bright, but you can still see them. The last thing I'm doing here on these butterfly wings is I'm taking some Perfect Pearls. I mixed a little bit of water in with them. Perfect Pearls are a mica powder, but they have a binding agent in them, so you can mix them with some water and create a shimmery watercolor paint. I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer to those butterfly wings, and I'm just doing it on the ends. And there is my butterflies before drying. Now, before or while waiting for them to dry, I noticed that I have several splatters on the one on the right at the top, but I kind of lost the ones towards the bottom. So I'm just taking a piece of wax paper, covering my image that I don't want any more splatters on, and I'm just going to add just a bit of splatters. If I'm going to be waiting for that butterfly to dry, I might as well wait for a few more splatters to dry as well. So I'm just adding some splatters to that background, exactly the same colors that I did before, but just incorporating those there. I didn't want to lose that and not have those in that bottom corner there. So I'm going to splatter those, and then I'm going to let that paint completely dry before I go to assemble my cards. Once they're assembled, I'm going to take these papers or these butterfly images, and I'm going to cut them down for the front of my card. I typically buy watercolor paper in 9 by 12 pads, and then I just quarter them so that I have sizes that would work for both 5 by 7 cards and 4 1/4 cards, 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch cards. This particular image, I ended up cutting a little bit smaller than I wanted to, so I'm just going to add a mat to it. When I have excess cardstock, I like to cut them down into mat sizes for my cards just to eliminate some of the excess, and you can see that I've accumulated quite a few. It comes in handy when you're doing something like this. It's easy to just grab a simple mat, and it's easy to color match, and it's nicer than cutting into bigger full sheets of cardstock all the time. So I've got my card bases already cut, but I haven't scored them yet. They are cut to 8.5 by 5.5, and I'm scoring them at 4 1/4. I like to use that scoreboard to fold them as well. I put it right into the corner so that I know that it's scored or that it's folded properly, and I've got everything nice and even. And I'm going to repeat that for the second one. I also use my scoring tool to really enforce that fold at the edge. I do it right now when I've got it in the corner, and then I also do it on a solid part of my scoring tool just to make sure I get a really nice fold in there. Once I've got my card bases completely ready, I'm going to take those mats and mats and images, and I'm going to glue them to the card base. I like to use Distress Collage medium because if some of it happens to ooze out while I'm gluing it down, it dries completely clear and it dries totally matte, and it dries quite quickly. I like using a liquid glue for this because if I put it down and it's not quite straight, I can easily move it until it's straight. I also take an acrylic block and I put it down on the mat while it's drying so I can continue working on other things. Now, because my watercolor paper has warped as I've been working on it, I am not only going to put an acrylic block on there, but I'm also going to I have a glass jar that has some glass beads in it that's quite heavy that I like to put on there just to give it some weight to make sure that everything has good contact with the paper while it's drying. It usually only takes about 5 minutes or so. It doesn't take too long, but it does take a little bit longer than if you had everything exposed to the air. Because you've got something on there, it just takes a little bit longer, but usually not too long. Once those are dry, my cards are ready. However, I did notice as I was going to show you these on the camera here, that some of the edges of the butterfly wings are a little bit dull from the watercolor pencils. So the easy way to fix that is just taking a baby wipe or a damp cloth, and I mean damp and not wet. We don't want anything too wet, and just wipe over the embossing. And that's going to take the excess of that watercolor pencil that is on top of the embossing, and it's just going to brighten that up, let it really show through and really shine. Make sure while you're doing this that you're regularly turning your baby wipe or cloth to get a new area. We don't want to be lifting up ink and then just placing it down somewhere else. And you'll notice that the embossing is a lot more shiny and brighter here. And there we have our completed cards. I didn't put any sentiments on them. I will wait until I'm going to use them and add the appropriate sentiment at that time. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.